Hey, are we live yet? I think we're live. Yes. Hello, Oliver Scholars, friends, and family. I'm so glad that we are coming together once again through awesome Facebook live stream. Thank you so much for joining this conversation. I am seriously excited. So when we all kind of hunkered down initially back in March to kind of like in response to this whole pandemic, I was like, okay, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to our kids in terms of their education? And of course, so many of us were able to switch to online learning platforms. But we know that families' capacity to execute on online learning varies for a host of reasons. And so my second thought was, oh my God, first we had to worry about summer learning loss. And now we have to kind of contend with the possibility that this school year has taken away a lot of progress for a lot of our kids. And so one of the things that this work has afforded me is the opportunity to have a tribe of activists, educators, seekers who are really bringing their best selves forward for the community. And so I've been fortunate enough to get 3 of those individuals to agree to be a part of this conversation on the COVID effect and what it means for our kids in terms of education. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first guest, soon to be Dr. Christina Grant, because I do believe in speaking things into existence. And Sister Grant is currently an interim superintendent for charter schools and innovation in the School District of Philadelphia. She has a long track record of changing the trajectory for young people. She's currently in a PhD program at the University of Pennsylvania. She already holds degrees from, Teachers College, shout out to my alma mater, Fordham and Hofstra. She is an extraordinary educator, always on the front lines for our kids. So please join me in welcoming Christina Grant.
Hi, Danielle. Thanks so much for having me. And honestly, I wanted to thank you before we get started. You have a long history and track record of mentoring women, particularly women of color. And you've known me, I think, since undergrad. And it's been amazing to have you be alongside this journey. So I just wanted to acknowledge the work you do in creating the leaders that you get to convene with. I don't know that many people thank you.
Oh,
I wanted to say thank you.
Thank you so much. So the next person, I believe, Christina, you connected me in Boracaya, yeah?
Yeah.
It's like you two sisters are so in sync with how you see the world. And we have been like Facebook buddies. We've gotten together in person. Every time I reach out to her for advice or counsel, Dr. Duncan is always on the case. She is currently head of upper school and director of inclusion and community engagement at the Cathedral School at St. John the Divine. She has 20 years of experience as a classroom teacher. So the 3 of us, I think all the panelists tonight have served their time in the classroom. She has done everything from workshops on diversity and inclusion to institutes, talks. She is an absolute champion for educational access and equity for Black and Brown students, but she also understands that when our kids are winning, all students are winning. And so with that, I just want to welcome Dr. Duncan to the circle.
Hi,
Hey,
Lakeela Duncan here. Thank you so much for this introduction and for the invitation. As you already know, when I said to Christina, I feel so lucky to be on this panel with such heavy hitters. So I'm grateful for this time and I can't wait for the discussion.
For sure. And last but certainly not least is Oliver Scholars' own Director of Academic Affairs. I just want to name the fact that he is the first Director of Academic Affairs at Oliver Scholars. He is an alum of the program, so he knows the impact of this work. He has taught English, math, and science in Korea and China. He just finished his master's degree in independent school leadership at Teachers College, another TC grad. And he's currently working on a second master's, because you know Oliver scholars go hard, in learning analytics. And just having him to really guide and focus the academic work that we're doing with our kids to prepare them for independent school life has absolutely been a game changer for this organization. And none of it would be happening without his leadership around instruction, pedagogy, all of those things. So Burnell, welcome to the circle.
Thank you, Danielle. Really honored. Obviously I'm a little intimidated because I'm the only non-PhD on the panel, right? So I know that, there's a lot of
working on her dissertation.
Well, yeah, but she's nearly there, right? So I'm outgunned. I look forward to learning a lot from everyone else, and I want to thank Dr. Moss a lot for guiding me through this first year at Oliver Scholars. Definitely could not have done it without your vision and your understanding for what we can achieve together for our students.
Thank you so much. You guys have all been incredibly generous. So my first question is, how do you think our students are faring during this pandemic academically? What are you seeing?
I guess I can start with that. I think what we're seeing is a combination of things. One, there are students for whom the way schooling is done in America does not work for them when they're in a school building, whether they're shuttled from room to room, or teachers are sometimes front-facing teachers, or there are other teachers who feel that participation always means that you have to speak out loud in front of everyone. Those students struggled a whole lot in school buildings. And I'm talking about all types of schools, whether they be public, charter public, parochial, or independent schools. And then we're seeing some children who they were acing everything they possibly could in the school building. And now where they have to create structures for themselves, we're seeing maybe that there's a little more support that they were either receiving that we didn't realize we were giving, and they actually need it. And then there are other students who it doesn't matter where you put them. They're going to do well because of whatever support systems they have at home, or they have this internal drive where actual grades are concerned, where they want to see an A or they want to see a 90, and that's the thing that drives them. So I think, honestly, you'll see all across the board, children are faring differently depending on what we either knew about them before this, or what we're now learning, and we're pivoting as quickly as possible to make sure that we're serving as best as we possibly can.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think that we are learning so much just in our ability to look at participation rates. And so, to Dr. Duncan's point, we had some students that weren't engaged at all. And, you give them a Chromebook and you let them learn from home. And, particularly in our high school level, high school students are far more independent than I think we even give them credit for. And so their ability to structure their day, their time, their work, that's been really interesting. And I think the one thing that goes without saying is our students miss each other, and they miss their teachers, and they miss the social aspects that come with schooling. Everything from recess to lunch that children argue that they don't like, but they do miss the actual interactions. And so you see children like wanting to stay in the classroom as long as possible, even if it's on computer, because they actually miss their teachers. And they miss that unique part of schooling that is definitely an art and not a science, and something that I don't think we can scale writ large across the system.
Yeah, I think I would add to Christina's last point. I remember our first week bringing our program online. So of course, as you are all aware, Oliver Scholars has a Saturday program, and so it's been a brick and mortar program for as long as it's existed. And then we had to respond to COVID and bring our program online. And we were really surprised by the level of engagement and visible enthusiasm that our students just across the board showed on screen, because they vocalized it. They said, we are so happy for the routine and to be, you know, engaged again, because as we know, like the DOE, when they first closed schools, they did not have an academic plan in place. But now we can see the fatigue in the classroom. And part of that obviously is we have to be mindful for how we would design like a virtual experience to deliver our goals academically. But the other issue is that for us, particularly Oliver scholars, our students have responsibilities to their Monday through Friday experience. And then they have responsibilities to us and to their next school that we're hoping to help them build. And those aren't necessarily aligned. So for example, a lot of the projects that they're expected to deliver now for their Monday through Friday school is really about getting ready for state tests, right? So at the end of the year, the schools are trying to get people beefed up to do well on the test. And that comes with a very different curriculum design compared to our curriculum design, which would be more focused on intellectual risks. And so what our challenge is to have a lasting and productive classroom on Saturdays, while at the same time that Monday through Friday experience isn't really an opportunity to reinforce that. And so the exhaustion is clear. But one of the benefits is that because we scaffold our students to reach out and talk about their cognition and their emotional state, they're reaching out to us and they're verbalizing those issues that they don't really have an opportunity to talk about, again, in their public school or their Monday through Friday experience. So it's a complicated conversation, because there are definitely the pros of seeing them leaning into becoming more functional adults, right? Which is their path. But at the same time, it's unfortunate that this is the context that's kind of like forcing them to respond and to, you know, become their better selves.
So I know that there was a lot of concern when schools were pivoting to online learning around disparities in terms of access and levels of support that would be available at home. Can you talk to me about any disparities that you're seeing that are of concern, and any ways that you've actually been pleasantly surprised around families' ability to support their kids in online learning?
I don't know, Dr. Duncan, you're a mom of
Yes.
these unprecedented times.
It's funny. So I'm at an independent school. All four of my kids are in public schools. And what I'm finding, which is going to be a very interesting statement that I'm about to make, and it might be because of the schools my kids are in, I'm not seeing a difference in what my kids are expected to do and what I'm expecting my students to do, which is a beautiful thing. And I also know that that's not the testimony of a lot of parents. The disparity that I would say I'm seeing most is not in tech, but in time. And it depends on whether or not there's a parent there that was already a stay-at-home parent that is learning now how to also be an educator, at least temporarily. That honestly would be the main disparity that I'm seeing. I know in public schools, like maybe 2 weeks ago, we saw that there were over 35,000, if not more, students who still hadn't received either an iPad or a laptop. And so they hadn't linked up with their classes at all. And these kids will pretty much be punished for that. And I do call it a punishment to have to go to summer school because you were not provided with something that you needed. And we just saw the news that if you're in elementary or middle school, it'll be 4 days a week for public school, for 5 hours a day, that you will be forced to look at a screen, which we know from data and all the research that that's not the healthiest thing to do. And if you're in high school, it'll be 5 days a week for 5 hours a day. But where the time is concerned, there are parents that are essential workers, and so they have to go to work, and they're relying on other people who are not educators to create the structure to help with homework, help with classwork. And I think across the board, that's where we would see disparities, again, regardless of what type of school the children are in.
Yeah, I think I'd say two quick things. I think some of the challenges we faced in urban school systems just were immediately exacerbated when we had to transition. I'm still blown away by how much we could accomplish in 2 months. I think for arguably decades, we called the question on, can we have a complete virtual system? Can everyone have access to a Chromebook? Can teachers teach from home? Can we set up multiple ways for us to be inside children's home? Can we do grades? I mean, there are the list of things that we have solidly said, like, oh yeah, this can be done. We've closed that gap really fast. I think the bigger question is, how do we control for the gaps that already existed? So our students that are housing unstable, our students that are food unstable, our students that, like Dr. Duncan said, their parents are essential workers. So they're essentially sitting at home and doing their work by themselves. Like, and I think the challenge with virtual learning, I can't underscore that point. It isn't the ability to get the child a device, and we still need to bridge the internet divide, which is bigger than a school system. It's absurd in 2020 that the internet is not a public utility, just like lights and water, and like you can't function without it. And so part of the biggest challenge is making sure that every child has access to the internet. I think underneath that literally is designing a structure for virtual learning that is like robust and engaging and is mindful of time. And how do you measure a child's engagement? How do you measure their interest? Like all of that is new learning for so many of us. I am a PhD student at Penn, and you log in class at 8 a.m. and you're still sitting in front of that computer at 7 o'clock. I'm a full adult, and it is unbelievably exhausting. And so when you think about how that plays out in the life of a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old, we still have a lot of work to do on the actual learning environment. And we know that, this isn't over. The likelihood that we'll be in this space in some way will be with us for a really long time. So it's actually a unique opportunity for us to reconstruct learning environments. And I think that is honestly the biggest challenge. Like if you don't have an adult that's watching you, if you don't have someone in the house that is like, look back at the screen or click the button or raise your hand, like it's hard for children to navigate that.
Pernell, did you want to add something?
Sure. I think I will second the point of internet being a public utility, right? In some ways, we've benefited from the fact that we have Chromebooks that we give to our scholars from their first summer with us. And so looking back, without that, it would have been impossible for us to deliver our online program. And so that was just a very, like a serendipitous ability that we had. But the issue of weekends at home with unstable internet access, I've been impressed by how our families, and I guess this is not unique to Black and Brown communities, but certainly city communities, and that urgency of being able to cultivate a community and with family and with cousins and with neighbors that you would call uncle and auntie. We've had cases where our scholars have been able to go to a family's home on the weekends because that family has reliable internet, right? But again, that's not like an ideal solution, especially considering like the mandate of sheltering in place with COVID. And so that's like an unacceptable risk to have to place yourself in because that family member has like stable internet access. So again, that's the complicated bit where we can see evidence of strength within our communities to respond well, but then at the same time, that response is complicated by non-ideal returns. And I don't, there's not a nice way to sew up the conversation. What we've done, we have made internet computer USB sticks available to our students for those who've got unstable internet, and we just check in with them every week We check their attendance and we check their class engagement, and we get them to loop back to us to express, any kind of connectivity problem so that we can address that to the best of our ability.
And I think the only other thing I would add is our parents have been rock stars through this. Like, I think we underestimate parents. Like, it's actually their children. And so, parents are like, we have launched, platforms to teach parents, like, how do you create a learning environment? How do you make sure your children can be ready to learn? Like, this is what your schedule should look like. And I, what Burnell said is 100% true. It's like, it's moms, it's dad, it's aunties, it's uncles, but there are adults all across the country that are like, we will not give up on children getting this education, and they're forcing themselves to become teachers. And so, on some respects, they're like, oh my gosh, we love teachers so much. Like,
yeah.
Walk on, like, educators. I think coming out of this, like, we will never argue about educators getting a raise. We will never argue again. But parents are really stepping up their game, and they're realizing, like, even in the midst of this pandemic, getting their children a quality education is never more urgent. And I've been blown away at seeing how parents are really, like, calling in all the resources to make sure that baby is sitting in front of that computer and, like, getting their work done.
Right. And I think they've underestimated themselves as well. And like, if we're ever thinking about what's another thing that this time of COVID has taught us, is that perhaps our edu-speak that we tend to engage in, that only certain people can understand, it's necessary that parents are able to access, like, when we say pedagogy, do all of us know what that means, to depending on who we're talking to? And so if we know that we require parents to be part of this village, it's like you said, it's their children. If they're going to be part of the village and part of this partnership in educating, we have to make sure that we don't have it so distant for them to understand what it is that we're saying and how we can receive support from them, and in turn, how we can support them.
So, one of the things that we have discussed and grappled with, maybe I grappled a little bit more than Burnell, is like, what is an ideal online learning experience for young people? We have so much, we stay in constant conversation with the independent schools that we pair our students with. And so we know, like, there's where they're starting, where the schools want them to go, and what our capacity is in between to, like, bridge and close some of those gaps and divides. And so, like, how do you make sure that they're getting the content that we're all so focused on without, like, completely overwhelming them so that they shut down? Like, what does good practice look like in this situation?
I would say a couple things. One, content is definitely extremely important, but more important right now is how are we maintaining relationships, like how the students are maintaining relationships with each other, how are teachers maintaining relationships with students, how are families maintaining relationships with the school and the teachers. More important than anything else. Secondary to that, I believe, is how we're implementing whatever it is that we're doing. Because if you don't have the solid relationship, it doesn't matter if you have a program that has been blessed by every educational god in the world. If parents don't know that you care for their child, regardless of what's happening, it doesn't matter what you do. But once you have that set up, what we've been able to do at my school, we have both synchronous times and asynchronous times, because again, we have to pay attention to what the research is saying about longevity where this is concerned. It is very hard to remain on screen for a long period of time, like Christina said, as an adult. If you're a middle schooler, and that's the division that I lead, that's the messiest time of life for you. You care about who says what, you care about how you look. They can say you're beautiful, and you're going to believe that they're saying that just to get something out of you. And so if we're keeping them on too long, where they get the chance to start thinking about those extras, that's where like we have to think about it. So we're getting the content across, but the questions that we're asking of them is making them look, or are making them look more closely at the world in which they live. And the reason that's important to me, and I think Christina is the only one who knows this story, I didn't finish 8th grade because I was in the middle of the Liberian Civil War. So we stopped school in the middle of 8th grade, and I had to figure out, without internet, how to still learn French, which is what we were learning, how to finish algebra, which is what we were learning, how to do science and ELA in a different way. And then when I came back to the United States, having that gap was something that I had to contend with. That's not something our children will have to contend with where the content gap is concerned. What we're going to have to do when we're finally back in our buildings is ask ourselves, what didn't we do social emotionally, so that when they're coming back, that they're not, that they're not feeling lost and that they're not feeling disconnected. The content will always be there. Amazon, they have issues, we know, and there are other ways for which people can purchase books for their families. But everything is available online. What's not available is making that connection and making sure that their hearts and their minds are whole once we get back into the building.
Yeah, I mean, that's why, talking after Dr. Duncan, like, why try? But I think 2 points that she said from like my seat and the work we're doing down here in Philly, I think it's an interesting intersection. The younger students, the collaboration between the teacher and the parent just have to be super, super tight, because you have to like help parents understand, like, your 5th grade student needs to be able to do the following things. And we are going to create these classroom environments to get them to do the following things. But at the end of every week, teacher, parent, we have to align on if the child was able to do the thing. And that's a different, parents are used to quarterly report card conferences or maybe weekly progress reports. But that touch point that might be daily for some schools is so critical, so that every day mom, dad, aunt, uncle can say, like, today, you are supposed to be writing a 3-paragraph essay, a dot. And some children are going to get it done while they're looking in the computer. Some children are going to have to go sit away and do it by themselves. But like, I think the rigor of virtual learning is so different, because it really is hand in hand with a teacher and a parent. And then I think at the high school level, it's everything Dr. Duncan said. Like, high school students, it's like, this is the roadmap to getting the credit. And we're going to provide a lot of supports. So like, I have a lot of schools where like, there's a Zoom that's just set up for Algebra 1. And like, there's an adult on the other side of the screen. And while kids are doing work, they can just ask questions. But that direct instruction, it doesn't work. And so we've had to become very, very creative on how do you create opportunities for kids to get access to teachers to help them unpack content. And then how do we work with the parents or the parental figure to support it? And I think what you said is so true. Like, we are not monitoring students logging in to monitor their work. We're monitoring to make sure an adult has had a touch point with them. So at the end of the day, we want to be able to say, did some adult from the school talk to every single child in the school? And if not, why? Because that's the most critical exchange, is making sure that a child knows that, like, even in a pandemic, we are still looking for you. We still see you. We still care about you. Kids need to know that. They needed to know that when we were in person. And I think they need to know that even more now. And so that the relational side of the work has been elevated to a significantly higher level, because the children need to know that we haven't forgotten them.
So Brunel, I just have to kudos to you, because sometimes at Olive Oil, I'll just like close my eyes and things magically appear. and online learning was one of those things. You were already taking steps to like decenter adults in the classroom and center the experiences of young people in the classroom. So I hope you'll speak a little bit about how that's playing out in terms of online learning at Oliver Scholars.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we very intentionally design our programs so that it sets children up for independence, so that they're completely the executives of their academic life. They are the captain of their academic life. And I think, well, I know that I'm coming directly from having attended an independent boarding school where, like, my parents, having my home family looped into my academic progress was not necessarily constructive, nor did the school expect it. One of the reasons I was at a boarding school was because they expected a level of independence. And for example, when grades were sent home, they were addressed to me. And I was the direct, communication with all of my teachers. And so I imagine that our goal is to set our students up so that they can thrive, and so that over time their parents don't have to do so much heavy lifting, because they've done the heavy lifting up to this point. That's how they got on the radar and were able to, become part of the Oliver Scholars family. And so now, with that responsibility for the student, we design a curriculum where the students have to recruit the instructors directly to be part of their success. And the curriculum is designed to stress them and to introduce weak points that they might not have seen. And I'd rather that they experience those weak points in our context than if they experience them in their second term, at boarding school in Connecticut. And as in terms of achieving that, we insist that communication with teachers is a student-teacher interaction, that it's not a it's not a parent-teacher interaction. Of course, parents are part of that conversation, but parents often want to sort of like leapfrog their student having communicated the problem with their instructor and become the intermediary for the student to improve. But that's not sustainable. And to achieve that, we've made our classroom more collaborative. So one of the emphasis is that we're helping our students learn how to basically work smarter, not harder. And also to sort of like deprogram them from the assumption that it's only hard work that reaps rewards. I understand that to this point, they've gotten to mid-8th grade in public school, and they've gotten there from their own independent hard work. But from my own experience in boarding school, I knew that I have to be talking with classmates and working with classmates and asking classmates for help in order to actually do well. And at some point, I have to be part of a team for my own individual success. I think that for parents, the important thing for them to ask is, what is the objective of any of the homework that their students are assigned? So many parents might notice that their kids are getting assignments that seem like busy work, and I would urge them to ask this teacher in the school to explain what the purpose of that work is, because ultimately, the purpose of work is not only about the classroom, right? The big picture is collateral learning. Right? Anything that you learn in the classroom should be developing a skill, some kind of disposition, some kind of mindset that's relevant beyond the immediate education context. And so that's kind of like the thermometer or the barometer or whatever you want to use, the index that I use when I think about what our classroom experience looks like. And that's for brick and mortar, and certainly more than ever for the virtual context, right? So always be able to explain why that activity translates into something that has impact beyond the classroom. And so that would be the takeaway in terms of thinking about rigor and thinking about questions that families should be asking. Families should be willing to dig deep into wondering, what's the objective of this? Is the objective of this just to be able to read 5 pages and to like rehearse this from by heart a week from now, right? That should not be the objective. The objective should be, sort of like scaffolding a skill in a very stealthy way that you can tap on when you're 25, and you don't even realize that you started to learn it when you were in 8th grade.
Great. So we have a question. Everyone's talked a little bit about social emotional connection, learning, you know, my nonprofit sensibilities. It's just good old fashioned youth development. What does that look like in a school experience? If I'm a parent of a young student, or any student for that matter, how do I know that the school is being intentional around keeping that sense of connection to my student?
So I teach a couple of classes to 5th and 6th graders during this time. I've always taught them equity and justice classes, but I've also now included current events classes. And a lot of the kids are reading so much about what's going on with COVID, and I wanted them to think about time as a continuum. And so I always hear the alone together, but the case is that a lot of people are actually alone, and there wasn't necessarily togetherness even before this happened. But wanting them to see that there should always be some type of connection between family and what they're learning in school. And so my assignment for them last week was to find the oldest possible picture that they could find, tell us the year that it took place, who was in it, what was going on at that time. And a few children were able to present today, which was beautiful. The oldest picture was actually from 1858, and we were able to speak about what people knew about the world at that time, how we've changed, what we know about the world now, who was enjoying life in a way that others weren't able to. How can we see that happening now with COVID? As many blessings as we may have, that's not the story for everyone. And they were able to have pride in what it is that their family stories could have been. They were able to share it with class members as well. And they were able to answer questions that maybe they wouldn't have had the opportunity to answer before, because maybe there were some assumptions that we made about whatever their situation was. And to me, that's something that, though it brings public speaking into account, it brings research into account, socially, they were able to feel that this is about me right now and not about what the title of the class is. And that connection to the social and emotional is, I can be me in front of you and be comfortable with that. And you can see the risk that I'm taking. You can accept that risk, and I can do the exact same thing for you. And I feel that we can do that even not necessarily in a school. If there are families that know each other and have each other's phone number, they can do something like that, where like it's families meeting families. A lot of times the families only see each other as they're walking in the school or walking down the block. There's so much we don't know about each other, and so we don't know each other's stories. And if I don't know your story, I can't empathize and I can't learn from you. And so in whatever it is that we're doing with social emotional learning, there has to be an exchange of stories, pretty much.
And I mean, I'd say it's really interesting. It's the biggest challenge that I think there are many challenges and they just keep getting on top of each other. But wellness and mental health, one, we're finally talking about it. It's been long overdue that we should be, from K through higher education, like we need to be talking about mental health. And I think we're finally at a point where when we say it's not okay, it's okay to not be okay, we mean it, because as a country, we are not okay. And so when we think about what that looks like inside of a school, like we make sure that guidance counselors are available. Advisory is never more important now. Before we used to like skip over advisory, or certain schools had different aspects of advisory. But that concept of like every morning we're going to come together and we're just going to ask the question, Danielle, are you okay? And we're going to sit. And then we're going to give students multiple ways to answer that question. You can answer it out loud. You can text message your teacher. You can send up a note. You can say a color. But like getting students to a place where they feel safe and free and ready to say, like, I'm not okay. And then having systems and structures to support it, that's the work of now. And in a lot of ways, it's more important than reading and writing, because if students aren't mentally whole, they actually can't do the work cognitively. And I think the second part of this mental health and wellness journey is going to be even more robust when we return, and whatever return looks like. We're going to need the same way that we pour love into our first responders. Like, the mental health community is going to have to show up for children in unprecedented ways. Like, we are going to need all of the therapists, all of the hugs, because we don't train our children, particularly poor Black and brown children. We don't train our children to feel. We actually praise them for having grit and being able to push through. And you can't push through a pandemic. Like, you cannot push through that grandma was here today and grandma is gone yesterday, and we actually can't even make sense of what happened. We can't force our kids to just push through that. And so as a community, as we think about what does it mean for us to come back together into school, or what does even school look like, we're going to have to pour significant resources into mental health and mental wellness, because our children are feeling. And if we don't protect those feelings, they'll manifest the way that they manifest now. And we can't fix this by increasing suspension rates, right? We can't discipline our way out of COVID. Kids are hurting. We're going to have to lean heavy into the hurting, and we're going to have to help our kids come out of the hurting. And what for us, that looks like meditation, that looks like wellness, that looks like healing circles, that looks like restorative circles. It looks like a lot of stuff that's not taught in higher education. Shout out to Columbia and Penn. Like, we're going to have to rethink wellness for our children. And
how can it not be a second thought? How can it be part of the system in the first place? Because conceivably, we shouldn't have been disciplining away that stuff in the first place.
Yeah. And like, when we're starting to think about literal tactile reentry, like, okay, student has a mask, we take their temperature, we spray their hand with hand sanitizer. Where's the checkpoint that says, like, did you eat this morning? Are you okay? Did you lose someone last night? Do you need to talk to someone before you walk into this school? And then is there a team of people that are ready to handle that before we put them in a seat and say, okay, let's read? And like, we're going to have to approach wellness that way, so that it's a part of our discourse and it's not something that is like hidden in the shadows. Because, I grew up in a Black family where we were like, you don't talk about what goes on in this house outside. And we are going to have to talk about what's going on in our houses outside. And children are going to find validation in knowing that, like, what happened in my house happened in Danielle's house, what happened in Burnell's house, like, it's happening in all our houses. And that's where the healing is going to take place. But as long as we're trying to like encourage kids to push through and, man up and like be strong, it's like, no, be broken, be brave, and we're going to be here to like help you get through it. Like, that's the next wave of this work, because then all of it doesn't matter. Can't go to college if you're broken. If you are not mentally whole, none of this will matter. Right. And we are broken right now.
Yeah. So I just want to say that I saw some conversation online that mortified me. And so some schools are actually calling child services on families that they cannot reach via learning platforms. And, I saw a story about a family that lost 4 members of the same family who lived in the same households of 8 or 9 people. And just like, so the schools are inflicting trauma on top of trauma. And so I understand, the tendency towards like order, control, and accountability. But what does a supportive educational institution look like in terms of like the parents and the caregivers? I know someone who's raising great-grandchildren. Her capacity to support kids educationally is not the same. We have families within the Oliver community for whom, English is not the first language of our parents. And so their kids have been able to, successfully navigate the brick and mortar schoolhouse, but that looks a little bit different when you're home and you don't have access to the same adults in the same way. So like, what does it look like, and why are we as a society like willing to repunish our families and pathologize our families?
So when I started before saying that I know that my testimony of public schools is not the testimony of every parent in public schools in New York City, I think the reason why people are able to call child services on families stems from several things. One, they don't know the children and the families in the first place. There's a warehousing effect of public schooling sometimes where you don't have to know, you don't care to know. You think, hey, these are people who are going to free school, and if you're going to free school, there are certain amenities that you should not have, one that being caring people, which is absolutely ridiculous. And then there's this deficit model that a lot of schools operate from, where we need to help those children get out of this neighborhood, even though this neighborhood produced them and produced that love of learning. And there's not a real community model that's been set up for that. I know in the schools that, and there's two different schools that my younger kids go to, and then my middle school to high schoolers go to, we got information before any of this happened. There were parent meetings. Some of them were online. There were phone calls that were made. Before this distance learning launched, there were also emails and phone calls specifically to find out if you hadn't responded to something via email, was it that you didn't see the email, or was it that you honestly don't have any way to connect? If you don't have a way to connect, then there were teachers who are still to this day mailing out packets to a lot of families. And again, I wish it were the case for every single public school, but that's not the case. In my independent school, there's always been that family connection where there's an understanding that we're not here just for the sake of the child. The child is a part of a family, and therefore we're here for the family. And that's a thing that I love about the vast majority of independent schools. Like, that's the setup of it. And again, as we come out of this COVID-19, because we're coming out of it, my hope is that all schools will learn best practices from each other and understand that there should never be a monopoly on best practices based on your zip code or on the cost of your school. And I think that when we do that, this family and community-centered approach to schooling will benefit us all, so that maybe we might start muddying the lines between traditional public, charter public, parochial, and independent.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the intersection of all of our systems making sure they're talking to each other, right? So when you get to the point that children are being removed from a home, that has to be like, you have to be able to have evidence that there is a greater risk for the child to be in the home than it is for them to be removed. And that shouldn't be if you logged on to the internet or not, right? So for us, it's very much like, how do we make sure that children have access to learning? And then how do we do no harm? And so exactly what you said, that we can tell you down to a student who's logged on and who hasn't. And then the questions begin. So is the student not logging on because they're not in the house? They're not home. They had to physically go live someplace else. Like the level with which students are in mass transition, not even because people are passing away, but because like their parents are essential workers. So like this week you're staying with this aunt, next week you're staying with this aunt. And even with the stay-at-home order, children are being moved just so that families can stay whole and things can make sense. But the school has to know that. The school has to be able, and it's not on the parents to make sure the school knows that. It's on the parent, it's on the school to make sure that they are in such close communication that they know where children are. And I think for us, like all the way down to our homeless shelters, we know our students are homeless. We know which shelters they're in. We know if they got access to food, and then we know who needs packets still versus who is able to figure it out. We are just wrapping our heads around hotspot distribution. Fun fact, hotspots cost more than Chromebooks. And so in this battle to bridge the digital divide, that's another layer. Like, who do we give home hotspots to? Who is paying for the hotspots? Because fun fact, they're not free. So even if you give them the device, it's like layers and layers of things that make sure our neediest students have access, but that they're not penalized for not having the access. And I'm in Philadelphia, in our system, I talk to the deputy commissioner of DHS almost every week. And so like when you get to a point where you're about to go into someone's homes, there are multiple levels of people that need to be involved and accountable as we make that decision. Because it shouldn't be you didn't log on and so you're in an unsafe environment. It should be, how do we make sure we know where children are and that we're meeting their needs?
Burnell, did you want to just talk about how we're supporting families?
Both of my fellow panelists have spoken about that, extensively and much more eloquently with a great deal more experience than I could refer to. I think the only thing I would add, which I would just, with a quick blurb, would be for education institutions to remember that they're childcare providers in addition to being institutions of learning. And so many schools, they forget that, or they don't prioritize that role as childcare providers, and they don't think about, oh, I'm taking care of this child's wellness, and so what is incumbent upon me in being, in taking care of their wellness? Like how granular is my knowledge of their family, and how can I tailor my response so that it's an individualized response and it's not some kind of blanket anonymous reaction where I call child services on a family. Right? So that would be the one thing I could add to that.
So I'm guessing that if we're going to start taking audience questions, folks, please type your questions in the comments area. Panelists, I hope you'll bear with us because I know we formally have only 8 minutes left, but I knew that this was going to be kind of a really hot discussion. So, I'll just kick us off. I am starting to see conversations around, oh, this is a great way to save money. We should do school online like forever. And, if there's one thing that I have learned about myself during the pandemic, it's that I actually love being in people's physical space and company. There is something about communing together, whether it is over books, whether it is over cocktails, whether it's over a meal, whether it's doing Zumba, as Christina and I and another friend used to do. To me, I think this made me more resolute that technology does have limits, actually. And so there are some things that I think we're all craving that we didn't even realize how important those senses of connection were. And I don't want to see the disparities in terms of opportunity, access, treatment that Black and Brown students already face to be further exacerbated by folks like looking to the lowest income communities and trying to save money on their backs. So what do you guys think about what online learning, the future of online learning? I know that there's some research that says cognitively this is not a permanent solution, but what are your thoughts?
But one thing, I think there are two, that what you said is one side of the coin. The other side of the coin deals with parents and schools in general, because we have to always make that value proposition, wondering what academic loss is there going to be after this, right? And I would argue that it's not just what students are learning right now, but how they are learning, that we won't necessarily be able to see that value proposition in the fall or even the fall after that, because they are learning in real time that problem-based learning isn't something that should be reserved for certain types of school or certain ages. They're learning that collaboration should never be a privilege, that it should always be something that's part of student learning. I think schools are also learning that there's a very big difference between a person who's a teacher and a person who's an educator. One will regurgitate what they are reading. The other one will facilitate learning for a student so that they're able to turn around and go tell somebody else how they know something and what they know as well. Where the cost is concerned, the higher cost that we're seeing in this is the fact that we've decided if you are in zip code so-and-so, you are only owed a certain level of education or a certain level of access. And we're seeing that across the board, if you're even in a different zip code, what you thought you knew and how you thought you knew that is up for grabs when there is a global pandemic. And so I don't think that it's wise for us to think about this as something that should be permanent. Even online programs have a lot of in-person activity and engagement that students are supposed to be contending with at the same time. And I don't think it's wise for us to continue this. Like, for headaches alone, we have to stop eventually. But this is a way to learn or a tool by which people can learn, but it should not be the platform through which kids can learn until we are actually living in the Jetsons world where it just doesn't feel this way.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting that, we talk about it like, oh, well, we're just virtually learning, or we're in a remote learning environment. And no, we are learning because it's a pandemic and no one can go outside. Like, we got to get real about it. Like, kids are not, like, no one is choosing this. This is not ideal. And the reason that, and it's not just because parents are like, oh my gosh, like being a teacher is really hard. We aren't designed as human beings to exist this way. We aren't, like, folks who are choosing to work from home, but they still have the option of going out. Like, there's a physical aspect of socialization that we as human beings are used to having regardless of where you live. And so, I always say and believe that this is going to be the ultimate test of people who espouse to have an equity agenda, because those people who have an equity agenda are going to step back and say, actually, we're going to be very clear about which schools return and how they return. And we're going to make sure there's equity around which children get to come to school, which children have to stay home. Because one would think that the students who have the most support would stay in virtual learning longer, and the students who have the least support would be brought back, because we know those students actually need to be in a physical environment. So there's gonna be a lot of conversation about equity, and just watch it. Watch the person who says equity, and then step back and look at the decisions that they're making and see if there's an alignment. Are the children that need to be in school the most being set up to get in school? That's question one. And then question two literally is around, all right, well, what did we learn? Like, because we actually learned a lot. Should we be buying textbooks that are paper-based? Should we be making sure that we're buying technology so that literal curriculum can move with children at a moment's notice? Those are things that we should think about economies of scale for, and figuring out how we save money. But we aren't going to mystically say, like, we need one teacher who can teach 500 kids. It's not possible. So much of teaching is the art of teaching. It's knowing that Danielle likes pink and Dr. Duncan likes blue. And the way to get Burnell to learn is to, like, call on him first. The way to get Danielle to learn is to actually tell her at the beginning of class, hey, I'm going to call on you. Be ready. All of that is teaching. And that can't get done through a computer screen, not even for our high school babies. Our high school babies, they need that safe place where they can go and be teenagers and be annoying. I miss my high school babies who used to just pop in my office to tell me if I was cute every day. Like, it's the socialization of the teaching and the learning and the love. And I don't even think we said that. Like, it's the love of education that can't get done in a virtual environment. You can't love up on our babies just through the computer screen. And so, it'll be interesting to see the decisions that are made in the days ahead. And it'll be interesting to see if those things truly align in the best interest of all children, or if we're going to continue to perpetuate a system where children who have the most get the most. This is a unique opportunity to do things dramatically different.
Brunel?
Yeah, just to add a final thought would be, real life is not online. And so part of the school's project is to prepare our children for real life. And again, aligned with those objectives of, collateral learning, like many of the things that you learn in the classroom are about some other context, a real life context. And so reducing all education to an online platform is actually handicapping our students. It's not setting them up for success beyond, in the real world.
Does anybody want to make, any predictions about what we can expect in the fall in terms of schooling? Even though I feel like I can't tell you what's going to happen tomorrow at this point.
I said this to you before we started, Danielle. I was like, it's going to be different. Like, it's not going to be, I can't predict the future, but I can predict that it's going to be different. And the level of flexibility and learning that we've already seen take place and just how quickly a system can adjust, that's going to continue forward. It's going to be three worlds. We're either going to stay exactly the way we are. We're going to come up with some hybrid solution where kids are going to school on some days and not going, or high schoolers are going in the morning. Like, it's going to be really interesting to see how we bring folks back together. Or we're going to live in a world where we're going to come together and then we're going to have to go back virtual, and we're going to come back together and we're going to go back virtual. Down here, we're trying to think about how can two things be true at the same time. So how can we run brick and mortar schools and also have virtual options that are running every single day, so that if you can only bring X amount of kids to school, like I wasn't joking about the equity agenda. Who are the children that actually have to come into the building? Because we need to make sure that they are eating. We need to make sure that a nurse has seen them. Schools provide so many societal functions that no one gives schools credit for. Shout out to educators. And we need to make sure that those children are coming to school and we are physically laying eyes on them. And then how do you trade off with children who actually, by virtue of what they were born into, they could stay home. They may not have to come to school every day. They may only have to come to school on Tuesday and Thursday. And then how do we monitor learning in an authentic way? Because I think, we actually haven't talked about accountability, but at some point we need to make sure our children are learning. And we're going to have to be very flexible as we think about that. And I do think the one thing that I will predict is that the need for mental health supports is going to be unparalleled. And we're going to have to wrap our heads around like what that means. But it's been an interesting ride thus far, and I think we're all gonna continue to learn and love together as we plan for the days ahead.
I somewhat echo what Christina said about it being different. My concern with that is that the driver or drivers of the decision on how different it will be politics and economics, and not necessarily what's best for children. I'm concerned that there will be experimenting done on how many people can fit in one room in order to make sure that businesses are open, and that the kids that can least afford to get sick because they may not have health insurance, or there's no one that's available to actually take them to a doctor, or they don't have a private doctor, that they're the ones who are going to be sacrificed in order to make sure that everyone else can become comfortable. And that's something that it has not ever not been the case in the United States. Mm-hmm. And I fear that this pandemic is not going to change people for the better. unless there's enough pain felt across?
I'm, I'm afraid I can't, I'm definitely not knowledgeable enough to give even like an educated guess at a prediction. I think this could be an opportunity for the public school system to learn from independent schools who've been shifting to a competency-based curriculum even before the arrival of COVID. And I think that they're going to lean much more heavily into a competency model when they rethink about what it is we're trying to achieve in what are we trying to deliver every day, and what's the point, what's the value of meeting with an instructor, and how could we, blend that if it's in person or it's online, as both of the other panelists have mentioned. But yeah, and I think that I agree. I'm concerned because the cynic in me, who has a lot more, pessimistic like inclinations, is thinking about how it's the people with the most power and the least real exposure from our perspective who are going to be in the decision-making position. And I'm concerned that those people probably aren't in a headspace to think about how other people are innovating, right? Specifically how the independent schools might be innovating towards a competency-based curriculum. And they'll only think of limitations. They won't think about how to innovate around so that you can design a competency-based curriculum for like an 8 million person city of children. So
I want to quickly shout out my competency-based high schools and my project-based high schools. We actually have a bunch of them in Philadelphia. I do not want people to think that traditional school systems have not started thinking about that. I would say the question is, can we start to think about those schools across the system and not just, in a system of 200 schools? How do you create project-based learning for an entire school? How do you create competency learning for an entire school system? And then, it's not the educator's lack of wanting to innovate. It's some functional things we have to rethink. We have to think about the credit and what does it really mean? We have to think about how many credits does it really take for a kid to graduate? What does a diploma mean? What is its core value? And then how do you design a school system around that? And so, so many of the things that we talk about, we like to make it live at the school level. And a lot of the decisions actually live arguably at the state and federal level, because they are the ones who set, a lot of power is left to the state level. And so it'll be interesting to see what the Board of Regents in New York is going to do. It'll be interesting to see what the state university is going to do, because as they are setting policy that dictate what LEAs are allowed to do, that's where your conversation takes place. Like, I write the waiver for some of my schools to require more than 23 and a half credits, to require advisory, to require, there's a lot of bureaucracy involved in what traditional school districts are allowed to do and aren't allowed to do. And as we try to unpack and think about what's possible for the future, the connection between what state departments of education are allowing districts to do, that's what's going to change the conversation around what's possible for a traditional student sitting in a classroom. It's often not a teacher not wanting to rethink education.
So I just want to say that there is so much on the news around the ways in which schools are failing our kids. I think it's really important to take these opportunities to highlight educators like the three of you who are on the front lines at a systemic level, at a local level, at a supplemental education level, really trying to rethink and reimagine pedagogy and what teaching and learning fundamentally are at the core of them. It's that same spirit that took me into this space professionally. I really only plan to teach like as a backup thing. And here I am, like almost 30 years later, and I'm addicted to, like, we can get this right. And I think the only reason I believe we can get this right is because I'm part of a larger tribe, a larger community that is tackling these issues. So I want to thank you all for participating. I know we could have gone on for a lot longer. Folks, if you got something out of this conversation, if you have friends who weren't a part of this conversation, This conversation is going to live on the Oliver Scholars YouTube channel, so you can continue to access these amazing educators. As always, I want to shout out our producer, Moshe Crone, who's just really kind of brought this whole thing together electronically. I also want you to know that on June 9th at 6:30 p.m., we're going to have a conversation about college access and the pandemic. So I know that at Oliver Scholars, our juniors are a mess right now. What are my grades going to mean when I start to apply to college in the fall? And for our seniors who are so excited about what to expect in terms of their first years in college, they have no idea what the future is going to look like, what financial aid is going to look like. We're going to tackle all of those issues. Look out for the invite on our Facebook page, June 9th, 6:30 p.m. I'm excited. Our own Randy Fraser is going to be part of that conversation. My actual high school guidance counselor, the person who was the reason I went to Swarthmore College. I got into Oberlin. Oberlin was my first choice. I picked a roommate at Oberlin, but Scott White went to Swarthmore and he advocated for Swarthmore, and the rest is history. I know that everyone didn't have a champion in their college access experience. I did. I'm thankful for that. I'm looking forward to that conversation. Did any of you want to offer some final words to the people before we end officially?
Ooh. What?
I mean, I'm the optimist, and maybe that's absurd. Danielle, I started teaching on 129th Street and Amsterdam Avenue, and was sold. I love my babies. I still know where many of them are right now. And I hate to say that we've got this, but we have faced, the hardest part of the work is the hardest part of the work. And we've faced challenges as a country. This is our biggest challenge. This is the biggest challenge of my lifetime. I'm actually proud to be an educator right now. And, educators are going to be on the front line, welcoming our children back and figuring out what school looks like. And, together, we're going to get through this. We don't have a choice. And so, I thank you for opening the space for this conversation. And I hope we continue to have more. I actually do think it's going to be through community and through conversation that together we come out of this and we learn from it. Because solidly, we should never find ourselves in a position like this again. But we've got this. We don't have a choice but to have it. We can't let a generation of children not learn. And I think we've seen this before, and I think it's our time to rise up as a country and get this right.
Thank you.
I would say, as a kid who went through school stoppage or an abnormal school situation, the people who went through that situation with me in the homeroom or the grade that we were in, after we endured that and were done with high school, I can say that I don't know of one person who didn't either work in the UN, become an educator, become a lawyer, become a doctor, become some type of entrepreneur, and still use what we learned at that time about ourselves and about advocating for a community as a whole. And if we could do that before Wi-Fi, I think these kids are going to be okay.
Thanks. Pernell?
Yeah, I think my only takeaway would be the embrace of technology right now is in a very individualized mode. And I think that we need to think about embracing technology to build relationships and communities, right? And so if anything, that would be the way we would emerge to thrive after COVID-19, because we've leaned into the technology and it's definitely an asset, but we need to be mindful to use the technology to expand our community and to deepen our connections to each other.
Well, on that note, follow Oliver Scholars on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook, and we will see you again on June 9th. Thank you so much.